truth was just beginning.
January 1945. Tokyo sleeps under a winter haze, the faint glow of street lamps flickering through the smoke of the previous night's air raid. The city is tense but unaware. In the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters, Admiral Shigeru Fukudome pores over intelligence reports, his brow furrowed. The data claims American B-29 bombers have crossed thousands of miles of ocean, striking targets deep in Japan. He shakes his head, disbelief etched in every line of his face. Outside, the faint hum of engines grows louder. Windows rattle, civilians stir, some clutching children, others freezing in confusion. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the sirens begin, a wailing scream that pierces the night. Tokyo wakes to chaos. Searchlights slice the darkened sky. Anti-aircraft guns rattle into life, yet nothing can be seen beyond the clouds. For Fukudome, the reports had seemed impossible. B-29s could not reach Tokyo. And yet, the sound of the engines, the distant thuds of explosions, and the panicked cries echoing through the streets would soon force him to confront an uncomfortable truth. The war had arrived at Japan's doorstep, in a way he had refused to believe. The sky trembles. The city braces. By late 1943, the Pacific War had reached a critical point. Japan, once an unstoppable force in East Asia, was beginning to feel the strain of extended supply lines and relentless Allied pressure. The victories of 1941 and 1942, from Pearl Harbor to Singapore, now seemed distant. American forces had advanced across the Solomon Islands, the Gilbert Islands, and were closing in on the Mariana Islands. Each conquest brought the U.S. closer to Japan's inner defenses. It was in this context that the United States Army Air Forces began to deploy the B-29 Superfortress. Unlike earlier bombers, the B-29 was a technological marvel. Pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun turrets, and a range capable of flying from bases in India or China to the very heart of Japan. The 20th Air Force, created under General Henry H. Arnold, was designed specifically for strategic bombing of the Japanese homeland. Its objective was clear: destroy industrial capacity, break morale, and hasten the end of the war. The Japanese, however, underestimated the potential. Intelligence reports on the B-29 were incomplete and often dismissed as exaggeration. Admiral Fukudome and his colleagues relied on decades of traditional naval warfare experience. Bombers had never before been able to strike the Japanese mainland from foreign bases with such precision. Reports from observers in China claiming that the Americans were assembling these enormous aircraft were treated with skepticism. Could a plane fly nearly 3,500 miles, fully loaded over hostile territory? For many in Tokyo, the answer was no. Meanwhile, Japan's homeland defenses were stretched thin. The Imperial Army and Navy had prioritized defending the perimeter of the empire: Manchuria, the Philippines, the Mariana Islands, believing that the main battle would be fought far from Tokyo's gates. Radar systems were rudimentary, anti-aircraft batteries scattered, and interceptor fighters limited in both range and number.
So crowded.
In practice, the Japanese military had little capacity to detect and intercept high-flying, fast-moving bombers like the B-29. Reports of American reconnaissance over the Pacific were noted, but often filed away as anomalies, mistakes, or exaggerations by intelligence officers seeking to provoke alarm. In the skies over the East China Sea and the Pacific, American forces were methodically preparing. B-29s were assembled in secret airfields in India, China, and later the Mariana Islands. Supply lines were painstakingly built, often through treacherous terrain. The logistics alone were staggering. Fuel, spare parts, and bombs had to be transported over thousands of miles, across jungles, mountains, and enemy-held territory. Engineers worked around the clock to modify runways capable of handling the massive 60-ton aircraft. Ground crews rehearsed loading, fueling, and takeoff procedures that would push men and machines to their limits. Strategically, the U.S. sought to leverage the B-29's unprecedented range and payload. Unlike conventional medium bombers, it could operate at altitudes above 30,000 feet, largely out of reach of Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft artillery. It could carry up to 20,000 pounds of bombs in a single sortie, striking targets deep within Tokyo and surrounding industrial hubs. Commanders in Washington understood that the psychological effect could be as decisive as the physical destruction. Japan, long isolated from the mainland of the Pacific War, would suddenly find itself under attack where it felt safest: its cities, its factories, and its civilian population. By December 1943, the 20th Air Force had begun its first B-29 sorties over Japanese-occupied China. Initial raids targeted small industrial installations and rail hubs, testing the aircraft's capabilities and the crew's endurance. These missions were perilous. Crews faced monsoon rains, treacherous mountains, and the constant threat of Japanese interception. Yet even these early raids demonstrated what many Japanese leaders refused to accept. The Americans now possessed the ability to strike at the very heart of Japan. Still, in Tokyo, disbelief persisted. Admiral Fukudome received intelligence briefings that detailed the range, payload, and potential targets of the B-29. He scrutinized each report, comparing it to decades of naval and aerial combat experience. "Impossible," he reportedly murmured. The Japanese command structure, steeped in confidence from prior victories and constrained by traditionalist thinking, struggled to grasp the implications of this new technology. How could a plane fly from bases halfway across the continent and arrive unchallenged over Tokyo? The seeds of shock were planted. Unseen by Fukudome and his colleagues, the Americans were methodically building a capability that would soon render all skepticism irrelevant. Preparations in the Mariana Islands were nearing completion. Crews trained for precision bombing. B-29s were being stockpiled, armed, and tested. Every flight, every maintenance run, brought the day closer when the sirens would finally scream across the streets of Tokyo. The city remained unaware, the admiral still doubtful, and the war slowly shifting toward a moment that would shatter assumptions about distance, technology, and defense. By early 1944, intelligence on the B-29 had reached the highest levels of the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army. Reconnaissance flights over China and the Pacific had spotted the massive aircraft, noting their size, speed, and unusual design. Photographs and reports made their way to Tokyo, but for many senior commanders the information seemed almost fantastical. The reports claimed that these bombers could carry enormous payloads over thousands of miles, bypassing traditional interception zones. Fukudome and his peers viewed such claims with skepticism. Japanese military doctrine had long emphasized layered coastal defenses. Fighters, anti-aircraft artillery, and radar installations were all concentrated near ports, airfields, and industrial centers. The notion that enemy aircraft could traverse vast distances over the ocean and strike the Japanese mainland unimpeded challenged decades of strategic thinking. For Fukudome, it was not merely a technical question, it was a conceptual one. The empire had never faced an enemy with such logistical audacity. "If these reports are true," he reportedly said, "we have underestimated our adversary gravely." Yet reports continued to accumulate. By mid-1944, reconnaissance over China documented repeated B-29 flights. Japanese engineers calculated the aircraft's range, the size of the bomb load, and the fuel capacity. Even conservative estimates confirmed that strikes on Tokyo were feasible. Despite this, the Japanese leadership remained divided. Army officers emphasized the improbability. The aircraft were too large, too fragile, and the logistics too complex. Navy officials less invested in the home island's air defense often dismissed warnings as exaggerations by overzealous intelligence officers. In parallel, Japan's own intelligence gathering suffered from systemic weaknesses. Radar coverage was sparse and technologically outdated. Interceptor fighters, such as the Mitsubishi Ki-67 and Ki-21, had limited operational ceilings and could not reliably reach the altitudes at which B-29s flew. The coordination between Army and Navy units was often inefficient, hampered by inter-service rivalry. By the time an alarm might be raised, a B-29 formation could already be above its target. Japanese defensive preparations also revealed a fundamental misjudgment: the human factor. Civil defense drills were sporadic, and many air raid precautions were designed with medium bombers in mind, not the high-flying, long-range B-29. Civilians had been taught to respond to sirens, but few could imagine what these massive bombers could do. Early warnings often went unheeded, and local commanders were hesitant to mobilize anti-aircraft batteries without definitive proof of an incoming raid. Meanwhile, the American strategy was precise and deliberate. From bases in the China-Burma-India theater and later the Mariana Islands, the 20th Air Force conducted extensive reconnaissance, target selection, and mission rehearsals. Pilots trained in high-altitude formation flying and long-range navigation, while engineers ensured the bombers could operate reliably over thousands of miles of hostile airspace. The logistical achievement was immense. Spare engines, bombs, and fuel had to be transported hundreds of miles across difficult terrain and hostile territory, often under threat of Japanese attack. By late 1944, the situation reached a tipping point. Japanese leaders could no longer dismiss the evidence entirely. A combination of captured photographs, pilot reports, and intelligence intercepts painted a chilling picture. The Americans were ready to strike Tokyo itself. Yet disbelief lingered. Admiral Fukudome and several of his contemporaries still clung to the conviction that the B-29's range was overstated, that the aircraft could not survive the long flights over enemy territory, and that even if they did, Japanese anti-aircraft fire or fighter interception would destroy them before reaching the city. This skepticism proved costly. In the months leading up to the first B-29 raid on Tokyo, Japanese defenses remained underprepared. Anti-aircraft positions were incomplete, searchlight networks were partially operational, and radar coverage left critical gaps. Fighter squadrons were concentrated on defending military assets rather than civilian centers. The failure was not just technological, it was conceptual. Japan's leadership could not reconcile their experience with this unprecedented threat. When the first B-29 engines roared over the horizon in the winter of 1944, Admiral Fukudome's disbelief would finally be confronted by reality. For all his calculations, all his reports, nothing in his decades of naval experience had prepared him, or Tokyo, for the sound of the sirens, the sight of fire in the city, and the knowledge that the enemy had found a way to reach the heart of Japan with devastating precision. The stage was set. Skepticism and unpreparedness would collide with American technological and logistical mastery. The next phase, the angles, will explore the human, tactical, technological, and leadership perspectives that define this critical moment in history. The first angle of this story is human, how the people of Tokyo and the Japanese military personnel experienced the looming threat. Civilians were caught between disbelief and fear. For years, the home islands had been insulated from direct attack. Air raid drills existed on paper, but most residents could not imagine a massive high-altitude bomber dropping tons of explosives on their city. The first distant rumbles of the B-29 engines sounded unusual, almost unnatural, as if the sky itself had grown heavy. Mothers clutched children, office workers froze mid-task, and soldiers at outposts scanned the clouds in confusion. Even those familiar with the war's progress were stunned. This was a war that had penetrated the very heart of Japan. Within the Imperial Navy headquarters, the human dimension was equally striking. Admiral Fukudome and his staff confronted the tension between intelligence and experience. Reports warned of bombers with unprecedented range and payload, yet the mind struggled to reconcile these predictions with reality. Officers argued, calculations were scrutinized, and skepticism dominated discussions. Some junior intelligence officers urged preparation, citing reconnaissance photos and pilot observations. Yet senior commanders dismissed the claims as improbable, almost fantastical. The psychological weight of this disbelief was palpable. Every delay, every hesitation, magnified the human cost that would soon arrive in the form of fire and destruction. From a tactical perspective, the B-29 represented a paradigm shift. Japanese planners had long relied on layered defenses, interceptor fighters, coastal anti-aircraft batteries, and radar early warning stations. But the B-29 operated at altitudes above 30,000 feet, largely beyond the effective reach of contemporary Japanese fighters. Anti-aircraft artillery, designed for medium-altitude bombers, struggled to reach the high-flying formations. Radar coverage was limited, especially along inland approaches to Tokyo. The tactical advantage now lay entirely with the Americans. The strategic planning behind the B-29 raids was meticulous. U.S. crews trained for long-range navigation, formation flying, and precision bombing. Bombers departed in waves from the Mariana Islands or forward bases in China, carrying loads of incendiaries and explosives designed to target factories, warehouses, and civilian infrastructure alike. Each mission required coordination between pilots, navigators, engineers, and ground crews. Success demanded endurance, precision, and the ability to overcome mechanical failures in flight, an unprecedented challenge in aerial warfare. Japanese defenders faced a tactical dilemma. They could concentrate anti-aircraft batteries around critical industrial zones or attempt citywide coverage, but resources were insufficient for either option. Fighter squadrons were dispersed, and coordination between Army and Navy units was inconsistent. By the time searchlights illuminated the first B-29s, the aircraft were already above Tokyo, moving faster and higher than Japanese planners had anticipated. The human operators, soldiers, gunners, and radar technicians were overwhelmed, often witnessing destruction they were powerless to prevent. The civilian population, meanwhile, experienced the raids on a visceral level. The high-altitude approach of the bombers initially made detection difficult. Then, as the first incendiary bombs struck, flames leapt across city blocks. Buildings ignited with terrifying speed, thick smoke filled the air, and the wail of sirens became a constant soundtrack to fear. Panic mingled with confusion. Families fled into narrow alleys, soldiers scrambled to man anti-aircraft positions, and medics prepared for an influx of casualties. The human toll was immediate and profound, a stark contrast to the tactical precision of the American crews above. This human and tactical intersection highlights the fundamental imbalance of the engagement. The Americans, leveraging technology and logistics, imposed their will from the sky. The Japanese, despite experience and planning, were unprepared for the scale and altitude of the attack. It was not merely a failure of weapons or strategy, but of perception and imagination. Admirals and officers had calculated the impossible as impossible, and the first B-29s proved them wrong. The story of Tokyo under attack is, therefore, a story of human resilience and tactical shock. Civilians endured confusion, terror, and loss. Soldiers faced an adversary that defied traditional doctrine. And Japanese commanders confronted a moment of cognitive dissonance. Their assumptions, shaped by decades of military experience, were no match for technological innovation. The B-29 had arrived, and with it, a new form of warfare, one that combined the precision of planning with the human cost of disbelief. The next angle will explore the technological dimension, the leadership decisions, and the enemy's perspective, deepening our understanding of this turning point in the Pacific War. The B-29 Superfortress was not merely an aircraft, it was a technological statement, a leap forward in aviation that the Japanese had never fully anticipated. At the heart of its design were innovations that redefined strategic bombing. Pressurized cabins allowed crews to operate at altitudes above 30,000 feet without supplemental oxygen for extended periods. Remote-controlled gun turrets provided defensive coverage that was nearly impossible for conventional fighters to neutralize. Its payload capacity, up to 20,000 pounds of bombs, made each aircraft a potential force multiplier. Range, however, was the most shocking factor. Flying from the Mariana Islands or Chinese bases, the B-29 could reach Tokyo and return without refueling, a feat previously thought impossible by Japanese military planners. From the Japanese leadership perspective, this technological edge created profound uncertainty. Admiral Fukudome and his contemporaries had to confront a dilemma: acknowledge the threat and mobilize defenses, or continue to treat the reports as improbable. Intelligence briefings, often dry and statistical, carried an almost surreal weight in these moments. Maps marked with potential flight paths, altitude estimates, and payload calculations clashed with decades of naval and military doctrine. For leaders conditioned to respond to conventional threats, ships, medium bombers, or invasion fleets, the B-29 represented an entirely new type of adversary. Commanders debated the credibility of reports, but time was running out. Japanese radar and anti-aircraft technology compounded the leadership challenge. Existing radar installations were designed to detect lower-altitude aircraft and to provide early warning against conventional raids. High-flying B-29 formations often slipped past these networks, arriving over cities with minimal notice. Anti-aircraft batteries, while numerous, were ill-equipped to engage targets at such heights. Leadership faced the unenviable choice of reallocating scarce resources to defend against a threat that, in their minds, might still be exaggerated. Any miscalculation could be catastrophic, either leaving civilians exposed or wasting critical defensive assets. The enemy perspective, the American approach, reveals the deliberate orchestration behind each mission. General Curtis LeMay and his planners recognized the limits of Japanese air defenses and sought to exploit them. By emphasizing high-altitude bombing, precision navigation, and coordinated sorties, the U.S. achieved tactical and psychological superiority. Every B-29 mission involved meticulous preparation, flight plans calculated to avoid Japanese radar when possible, formation tactics optimized to reduce vulnerability, and payloads designed to strike industrial centers with maximum efficiency. The Americans understood that the mere presence of the B-29 over Japanese cities would have an effect beyond bombs. It would force leaders like Fukudome to confront their own disbelief and inadequacy. Technological supremacy also influenced strategy at the operational level. B-29 crews were trained to handle equipment failures, adjust for weather, and navigate over long distances with minimal support. Each mission demanded precision and endurance, testing the limits of human and mechanical capability. In contrast, Japanese forces lacked equivalent platforms or countermeasures, leaving them reactive rather than proactive. When the sirens finally screamed over Tokyo, the Japanese command could only respond, often in confusion and haste, while American bombers executed their mission with near-clockwork accuracy. Leadership failures were not solely a matter of skepticism. They were compounded by inter-service rivalry. The Imperial Army and Navy had different priorities, doctrines, and chains of command. Coordination on air defense was inconsistent, leaving gaps in coverage that B-29s exploited. Even as reconnaissance reports confirmed the bombers' capabilities, bureaucratic friction delayed decisive action. The very hierarchy meant to protect the homeland became a liability, illustrating how leadership, and its ability to adapt, can be just as decisive as technology in warfare. From the Japanese perspective, the B-29 was more than a weapon. It was a psychological disruptor. The realization that these aircraft could reach Tokyo unimpeded challenged assumptions about security and invulnerability. Leadership faced not only the material threat of bombs but the intangible threat of fear and uncertainty. The American approach magnified this effect, combining the power of technology with the strategic advantage of surprise, forcing Japanese commanders to react to a reality they had previously deemed impossible. In the convergence of technology, leadership, and enemy strategy, the stage was set for a decisive turning point. The B-29 was not just striking the Japanese homeland, it was striking the confidence of those charged with defending it. The human, tactical, and technological elements were now fully aligned, and the city of Tokyo and its leaders would soon confront the consequences of underestimating this formidable new weapon. The winter morning of November 24, 1944, dawned gray over Tokyo. Frost clung to rooftops, and the streets were quiet, save for the faint sound of trams and footsteps echoing along narrow alleys. In the Imperial Navy headquarters, Admiral Fukudome reviewed reports with his staff, still uneasy, but holding on to the hope that the rumored B-29 threat was exaggerated. Calculations, maps, and reconnaissance photographs lay spread across the table, yet the reality of what was about to occur was beyond imagination. At 7:32, distant hums began to rise over the city. Soldiers on observation posts squinted into the overcast sky, noting faint specks glinting in the cold morning light. Within minutes, the unmistakable drone of multiple engines filled the air, low at first, then escalating in a chorus of mechanical might. It was the first B-29 raid on Tokyo. Civilians scrambled, street markets emptied. Factory workers fled to shelters, clutching children, blankets, and whatever possessions they could carry. The wailing of air raid sirens cut through the fog, blending with the clamor of shouting officials and the sudden rattle of anti-aircraft batteries awakening across the city. Tokyo's defenses, incomplete and uncoordinated, responded in fits and starts. Guns fired into the sky, but their shells fell short, exploding harmlessly in the distance. Searchlights pierced the clouds, only to reveal fleeting silhouettes that disappeared almost instantly into the gray. Inside the command center, Fukudome's disbelief began to waver. Intelligence reports had predicted high-altitude attacks, yet the reality was more terrifying than any document could convey. The B-29s, massive and seemingly invulnerable, glided above 30,000 feet, their presence an impossible combination of grace and menace. Each aircraft carried tons of incendiary bombs, aimed at industrial facilities and urban clusters alike. The potential for destruction was staggering, and for the first time, Japanese leadership confronted the limitations of their defensive doctrine. The raid unfolded with precision. Over the next hour, bombers released their payloads in coordinated patterns, targeting factories producing aircraft engines, steel components, and chemical materials essential to Japan's war effort. Explosions ignited fires that spread rapidly, fed by densely packed wooden buildings. The sky darkened with smoke, and the roar of detonations echoed through the city, reverberating off mountains and valleys, creating a sense of chaos that even seasoned officers found disorienting. For civilians, the experience was immediate and terrifying. Families sought shelter wherever possible, basements, narrow alleyways, and improvised bunkers, while above them firestorms began to consume entire neighborhoods. The psychological shock was profound. A threat long considered improbable had become undeniable. Children screamed, dogs howled, and a city accustomed to distant battles now felt the war intimately, in every tremor of the ground and every flash of light above. Tactically, Japanese defenses were exposed. Fighter planes scrambled, often too late, and struggled to reach the altitude of the B-29s. Anti-aircraft batteries fired thousands of rounds, yet the bomber formations adapted, using evasive maneuvers and altitude advantage to avoid destruction. Each failed interception reinforced the reality that the Japanese homeland was vulnerable in ways previously unimagined. The leadership could only watch, impotent, as precision and technology dictated the battlefield. The raid lasted less than 90 minutes, but its impact was enduring. Fires raged across Tokyo, consuming factories, warehouses, and residential districts alike. Casualties were significant, though exact numbers were difficult to ascertain amid the chaos. For Fukudome, the impossible had become undeniable. The B-29 could reach the heart of Japan, strike with devastating accuracy, and evade the defensive measures upon which he had relied. American reports later described the raid as a near-perfect execution of strategy. Bombs hit intended industrial targets with a precision that Japanese observers initially doubted could be achieved at such altitudes. The raid's psychological effect was immediate: shock, fear, and the collapse of disbelief among Japanese leaders. For the first time, Tokyo's command structure understood the magnitude of the threat hovering above their city. This first raid marked a turning point in the Pacific War. The theoretical became reality, and the calculated skepticism of Japanese leadership gave way to urgent reassessment. Fukudome's earlier doubt had transformed into grim acknowledgement. The war had arrived over Tokyo, and the enemy's technological and logistical superiority could not be ignored. As the last B-29s disappeared over the horizon, Tokyo lay smoldering. Smoke and fire stretched across districts, sirens continued to wail, and civilians emerged from shelters to witness devastation that would be etched into memory forever. The clash between disbelief and reality had reached its peak, but the full extent of the bombing campaign, and its consequences for Japan, was only beginning. The initial raid on Tokyo was only the beginning. Over the following months, B-29 missions intensified, each sortie increasing in frequency, altitude, and destructive power. By early 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army had no choice but to confront the stark reality. The homeland was vulnerable in ways previously unthinkable. Admiral Fukudome, once a skeptic, now presided over a command structure grappling with continuous bombardment and mounting panic. Subsequent raids followed a pattern of precision and terror. B-29s, taking off from newly established bases in the Mariana Islands, flew in tight formations, maintaining high altitude to evade Japanese fighters. Cities such as Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokohama soon joined Tokyo as targets. Each mission carried tons of incendiary bombs, designed to ignite firestorms in densely built urban areas. Fires spread uncontrollably, and winds carried smoke and embers into surrounding neighborhoods, amplifying destruction far beyond the immediate targets. The human cost escalated. Civilians faced repeated sirens, smoke-choked air, and the collapse of neighborhoods. Families who had survived one raid were forced to flee again, often into areas equally vulnerable. Emergency services were overwhelmed, hospitals flooded with casualties, and the psychological toll compounded daily. Soldiers and officers, trained for conventional warfare, found themselves responding to a type of attack that defied prior experience. The gap between Japanese expectations and American capabilities became undeniable. From a tactical perspective, Japanese defenses struggled to adapt. Anti-aircraft artillery, though increasingly concentrated around key industrial zones, remained largely ineffective against high-altitude formations. Fighter interceptors attempted to engage the B-29s, but most missions ended with minimal success. Each sortie highlighted the technological imbalance. The Japanese could detect and respond only partially, while the Americans dictated both timing and target selection. Leadership was now in full crisis mode. Meetings in Tokyo became tense exercises in damage control and strategic re-evaluation. Fukudome and his colleagues reviewed reconnaissance photographs, bomb damage reports, and survivor testimonies. The cumulative evidence left no room for doubt. The B-29 threat was real, operational, and growing. Previously held assumptions about homeland security were shattered, replaced by urgent deliberation on how to protect cities that were now exposed and increasingly indefensible. The cumulative raids had a dual effect. They not only inflicted physical destruction, but also dismantled the psychological foundation of Japanese command. Disbelief had transformed into fear, fear into urgency, and urgency into strategic desperation. Plans to counter future raids became frantic, with radar networks expanded, anti-aircraft batteries repositioned, and fighter squadrons scrambled to cover the most threatened urban centers. Yet each measure came too late, constrained by limited resources and the sheer technological advantage of the B-29s. For the Americans, the raids represented the triumph of preparation and innovation. Crews understood the importance of coordination and precision. Each mission was carefully calculated to inflict maximum damage with minimal risk. The psychological impact on Japanese leaders was anticipated. By demonstrating the capability to reach the heart of Tokyo repeatedly, the Americans forced a reaction, destabilizing command structures and exposing weaknesses in homeland defense. By March 1945, the effects were unmistakable. Fires had reshaped Tokyo's landscape, key factories lay in ruins, and civilian morale was eroding under the relentless pressure of aerial bombardment. Admiral Fukudome and other senior officers faced the unpalatable truth. Their assumptions about distance, aircraft capabilities, and air defense were obsolete. The enemy had demonstrated a level of technological and logistical sophistication that Japan could not counter effectively. In essence, the turning point was not a single raid, but the relentless succession of operations that made disbelief impossible. The sirens that once startled a skeptical population became a constant reminder of vulnerability. The strategic shock was compounded by the human cost, tens of thousands of casualties, mass displacement, and the destruction of industrial capacity critical to the war effort. Japanese command could no longer rationalize or delay. The threat was undeniable, immediate, and existential. By mid-1945, the cumulative effect of the B-29 raids had forced a profound shift in Japanese strategy. Leadership prioritized civilian evacuation, emergency fire control, and the reorganization of air defenses, though these measures could never fully mitigate the technological superiority of the U.S. bomber force. Admiral Fukudome, who had once dismissed the B-29 as impossible, now presided over a defensive effort born from desperation, constrained by both time and resources. The turning point had been reached. Tokyo, once insulated from direct attack, lay exposed and ravaged. Japanese leadership had confronted the stark reality of modern aerial warfare. Disbelief had given way to devastation, skepticism to survival. And in the skies above the homeland, the B-29 had rewritten the rules of engagement. By the spring of 1945, Tokyo bore the scars of relentless aerial bombardment. Streets once bustling with commerce were reduced to ash. Factories that had fueled Japan's war machine lay in ruins. and entire neighborhoods had vanished beneath firestorms. Casualty estimates varied, but tens of thousands of civilians had been killed or injured, and countless more displaced. Families huddled in makeshift shelters, scavenging for food and water, while emergency services struggled to contain blazes and tend to the wounded. The city's infrastructure, water supply, communications, transportation, was severely disrupted, creating cascading challenges for both civilian and military authorities. The psychological impact on the population was profound. Citizens previously insulated from direct attacks faced the stark reality of vulnerability. Children, traumatized by the wail of sirens and the flash of bombs, bore witness to destruction beyond comprehension. Adults confronted a new type of warfare, one in which survival depended not on combat skill, but on the chance of being out of harm's way. Panic and uncertainty became a constant undercurrent, influencing daily life and undermining morale in ways that conventional battles never had. For the military, the aftermath was equally significant. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army had been forced to acknowledge the limits of their defensive capabilities. Anti-aircraft batteries had expended vast quantities of ammunition with minimal effect. Fighter squadrons scrambled repeatedly, suffered losses and attrition without halting the B-29s. Commanders recognized that strategic air defense had become not just a tactical challenge, but a strategic imperative, one for which Japan was increasingly ill-prepared. Reports from officers in the field described frustration, exhaustion, and the growing awareness that the homeland was no longer inviolable. The raids also exposed gaps in intelligence and planning. Reconnaissance failures and delays in interpreting reports had allowed American forces to achieve surprise. The disbelief that Admiral Fukudome and others had harbored regarding B-29 capabilities had translated into critical delays in reinforcing air defenses. By the time measures were taken to reposition anti-aircraft batteries or concentrate fighter coverage, the Americans had already adapted their tactics. Each raid underscored the cost of underestimating technological innovation and highlighted the human limitations of command under unprecedented conditions. Beyond immediate destruction, the raids accelerated a shift in Japan's broader war strategy. Previously confident in the natural barriers provided by distance and geography, Japanese leaders now understood that these advantages had been nullified. Civilian evacuation programs were hastily expanded, with cities like Tokyo designating shelters and relocating families to rural areas. Industrial production was partially decentralized, though logistical challenges limited effectiveness. The military sought to bolster radar coverage and refine fighter deployment, but each adaptation came too late to prevent further devastation. Reports and photographs circulated within the Japanese High Command documented the scale of destruction. Smoldering ruins, flattened districts, and rivers of fire sweeping through urban centers. Witness accounts described streets unrecognizable, with survivors wandering among charred skeletons of homes and factories. These records were more than operational data. They were proof that the reality of the B-29 threat had eclipsed speculation. Admiral Fukudome, once a skeptic, now had no choice but to accept what had already occurred. The age of safe, invulnerable cities was over. From the American perspective, the raids had achieved their objectives. The combination of technological superiority, meticulous planning, and relentless execution had inflicted physical and psychological damage far beyond the immediate impact of bombs. The United States had demonstrated the effectiveness of long-range strategic bombing, validating the massive logistical and financial investments in the B-29 program. For the Japanese, the aftermath was a stark lesson in vulnerability, illustrating how rapidly technological innovation could outpace traditional defense strategies and force a recalibration of both military and civilian priorities. As the smoke cleared and Tokyo's devastated districts began to be assessed, one fact became undeniable. The B-29 had changed the war over Japan. Disbelief had been replaced by shock, strategy by reaction, and a once confident command by a desperate scramble to adapt. The city and the nation would never again view its skies as secure. As spring turned into summer 1945, the cumulative effect of the B-29 raids on Tokyo and other Japanese cities became increasingly apparent. The destruction was no longer confined to isolated districts. Industrial hubs, transportation networks, and residential areas alike bore the scars of repeated bombardment. The psychological weight of these raids extended far beyond the immediate devastation. For Japanese leaders, the homeland was no longer a secure stronghold. It was a battlefield under constant threat. Admiral Fukudome and his contemporaries faced the sobering reality that the enemy had achieved what they had long believed impossible. Strategically, the raids forced a recalibration of Japanese military planning. Previously, resources had been concentrated on defending the empire's periphery, from the Philippines to the Marianas, under the assumption that attacks on the homeland were unlikely or unsustainable. The reality of long-range bombing exposed this miscalculation. Air defense networks were hastily expanded, with radar stations upgraded where possible, anti-aircraft batteries redeployed, and fighter squadrons repositioned to protect urban centers. Yet logistical constraints, shortages of fuel and aircraft, and internal rivalry between the Army and Navy limited the effectiveness of these measures. Each defensive adaptation was reactive, arriving only after the Americans had already demonstrated their capabilities. The raids also reshaped the psychological landscape of the Japanese population. Civilians, once insulated from direct military action, now experienced the war in a visceral, daily manner. The recurring wail of sirens, the omnipresent smoke, and the destruction of familiar neighborhoods instilled pervasive fear. Families were displaced, social cohesion frayed, and morale plummeted. The sense of invulnerability that had once defined life in Tokyo was gone. Communities were forced to confront the fragility of their existence, and the memory of the first raid's shock lingered in every subsequent alarm. Military leadership, too, felt the long-term impact. Officers recognized that the B-29's technological advantages could not be overcome through conventional tactics alone. The disparity in altitude, speed, and payload made interception extremely difficult. Even when fighters managed to engage the bombers, losses were minimal relative to the scale of destruction inflicted. Strategic discussions shifted from offensive operations abroad to homeland defense, highlighting how a single technological innovation could redefine priorities across an entire military hierarchy. The raids had profound implications beyond immediate military and civilian spheres. Japan's industrial capacity suffered irreparable damage in many sectors. Factories producing aircraft engines, steel, and chemicals, critical components of the war effort, were destroyed or rendered inoperable. Supply lines were disrupted, and the loss of manufacturing centers contributed to shortages on both the home front and battlefronts abroad. The cumulative effect eroded Japan's ability to sustain prolonged resistance, weakening the strategic position of the nation even before the arrival of Allied ground forces. Reports from the field emphasized both material and moral consequences. Soldiers noted the demoralizing effect of seeing the home cities in ruins, understanding that their families and communities were directly in harm's way. Civilians reported fear and despair, while official communications revealed an acute awareness of vulnerability at the highest levels of command. The psychological pressure, combined with tangible losses, forced Japanese leadership into a defensive posture that constrained operational flexibility and eroded confidence in long-term victory. From the American perspective, the raids validated the strategic vision of long-range bombing campaigns. The combination of planning, technological superiority, and relentless execution had reshaped the Japanese approach to warfare. For Japan, the aftermath was a stark testament to the dangers of underestimating technological advancement, the limits of traditional doctrine, and the human consequences of strategic miscalculation. In essence, the B-29 raids achieved more than destruction. They imposed a shift in mindset. Admiral Fukudome and his colleagues could no longer operate under assumptions of security or disbelief. The psychological and strategic shock reverberated across every level of Japanese society, forcing the nation to confront the terrifying reality of modern aerial warfare. The skies above Japan were no longer a buffer. They were a theater of relentless pressure, a crucible in which the limits of defense, leadership, and human endurance were tested. This cumulative devastation and strategic reckoning set the stage for reflection on the broader significance of the B-29 campaign. The next section, Reflection/Closure, will examine the lasting lessons of this technological, psychological, and historical turning point in the Pacific War. The B-29 raids on Tokyo stand as a stark testament to the intersection of technology, strategy, and human perception in modern warfare. What began as disbelief among Japanese leaders an assumption that the enemy could not reach the heart of the homeland, was transformed into undeniable reality through meticulous planning, engineering ingenuity, and relentless execution. The sirens that once startled a skeptical city became a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that the rules of engagement had changed irrevocably. In these raids, the human dimension was inseparable from the technological. Civilians endured firestorms, loss, and displacement, while military leaders confronted a threat that defied the doctrines they had relied upon for decades. Admiral Fukudome's moment of recognition, when skepticism gave way to the harsh reality of B-29 bombardment, illustrates the psychological shock that innovation can impose on even experienced command. It was not merely bombs that altered the course of war, but the interplay of disbelief, adaptation, and the relentless application of strategic advantage. Strategically, the raids reshaped Japanese priorities, forcing a defensive posture that strained resources and morale. The technological leap represented by the B-29, range, payload, and altitude, redefined what was possible in aerial warfare and demonstrated how mastery of logistics and innovation could overwhelm even the most disciplined defense. It also marked a turning point in the Pacific War, signaling that no city, no industrial center, no assumption of safety was beyond the reach of modern aerial assault. Yet beyond strategy and destruction lies a more enduring lesson. Warfare is not only a contest of machines or tactics, but of perception and preparedness. The B-29 raids remind us that disbelief, even among the most experienced leaders, can have consequences as tangible as the bombs themselves. The human cost, the disruption of life, and the shattering of assumptions all underscore the profound impact of technological transformation on society, psychology, and history. As Tokyo smoldered beneath the winter sky, the city and the nation witnessed the dawn of a new era in war. The lessons endured. Innovation is unstoppable, vigilance is essential, and the line between skepticism and devastation can be measured in the sweep of a bomber's shadow across the skyline.
We have confirmation. The mission is a success.
Yes! We did it!
Mission successful!
We did it!